Elba. And number three, it's essential to reflect on the reasons behind the historical failure to overlook these mistakes. Now, as you can see, I think the third one is going to be the most controversial. And I should say that the article on which this talk is based it was nowhere near as strident on point 3 as it was on 1 and 2. So even if you're one of the 3 people in the world who's read this article, which is out last month in the Mariner's Mirror, I hope that I can still tell you something new today. So, number 1, the British were more responsible than most realized for putting Napoleon on Elba. So, on March 31st, 1814, the Russians took Paris. A week later, Napoleon abdicated. The question facing the Allies was what to do next. The British cabinet seems to have been initially uncertain about what to do, but the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Viscount Castlereagh, helped drive them towards support for the Bourbon Restoration, in other words, to bring the Bourbons back, having been gone since the French Revolution. In a rare example of not keeping his cards close to his chest, Castlereagh openly toasted the Bourbon cause before Napoleon's abdication, and he told the cabinet that the first step after the occupation of Paris would be the restoration of the Bourbons. So Castlereagh, from his perspective, is likely weighing the problems of a Bourbon restoration with the alternatives and judged that it was better both for the stability of Europe and the maintenance of the fragile Allied coalition for a known mediocrity. Nobody thought Louis XVIII knew what he was doing, but he's sort of just a lump. He's fine to sit on the throne than to let the French decide for themselves who to put on the throne, because that could end dangerously. Now, the British by themselves couldn't have brought about the Bourbon Restoration, right? The British wielded significant power among the Allies through their naval power and their subsidies, but little could happen in Paris in the spring of 1814 without the support of the Tsar, whose army was currently camped in the city, right? So Tsar Alexander was initially unenthusiastic about the Bourbon restoration, but only the news that the citizens of Bordeaux had declared for the Bourbons in late March changed his mind, and he agreed to it. Now, that's not, however, why the standard accounts pin the blame for Elba on the Tsar, right? He usually emerges as the villain of the story, the Elba story, including even in a book written for the express purpose of highlighting the forgotten role of the Russians in the defeat of Napoleon, because he was the man on the spot in Paris in the first week of April who offered Napoleon his new kingdom. So I'm not going to dispute that. That's definitely what happened. For the 10 days after the Russians took Paris, the Tsar handled negotiations with Napoleon. His approach was shaped by a range of overlapping concerns, including avoiding a civil war, preventing Allied troops from sacking Paris. So he explicitly rejected the idea of reprisals against the French, saying later that, quote, one ought never to take vengeance except by doing good for evil. So it was in that context that he generously offered Elba to Napoleon without consulting the other allies. Now, he was able to do this because neither Castlereagh nor Metternich were present in Paris in those first 10 days of April. They finally arrived on April 10th, and upon learning of the Tsar's decision to allow Napoleon to go to Elba, both men immediately realized this was a mistake. But the Tsar had committed himself in public, and he refused to go back on his word. I offered Napoleon Elba, I can't go back on that. Thus, most of the historians blame the Tsar, not Castlereagh or Metternich, whose absences are excused. In fact, their absence from Paris in the first 10 days of April requires some explanation. The reason they weren't there is that they've deliberately chosen not to be there. As the Allied armies converged on Paris, they watched from Dijon. Now, Castlereagh decided not to go to Paris because, as he told Wellington, he wanted to avoid making it look like the Allies were planting the Bourbons on the throne. It was important to make this look like someone else's decision. Of course, that's exactly what they were doing, right? But the goal was to make it look like a French idea or maybe a Russian idea. He was happy to watch the Tsar take on that challenge so that the Tsar would take the blame if it went wrong. Meanwhile, Metternich wanted to avoid embarrassing his king, his sovereign. Napoleon had married Marie Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, and their young child was one of the possibilities mooted as a new ruler for France. So it was decided instead to give the empress and her son some Italian duchies. So Metternich wasn't eager to advertise that Emperor Francis was not supporting his own grandchild's claim to the French throne. So as a result, he and Castlereagh explained their absence by claiming that the roads from Dijon to Paris were impassable. This is a bold-faced lie, because Wellington's niece, who was with them in Dijon, hurried to Paris on those very roads that were impassable to be with her husband. So even when Sir Charles Stuart, who's Castlereagh's half-brother, wrote to him from Paris with increasing alarm about the decision that the Tsar was making, Castlereagh didn't hurry to join. So the absence of the two most qualified allied negotiators created the circumstances for the Tsar's mistake. When Metternich found out about this, he was livid. He directed his anger at the Tsar, at the ministers around the Tsar, and at himself for letting the Tsar out of his sight. He was convinced that Napoleon could not be contained on Elba, and he tried in vain to get the Tsar to go back on his word. He wrote to colleagues that the Tsar was behaving, quote, like a pupil who has escaped his teacher, say Metternich, and that the Tsar was, quote, the biggest child on earth. He has begun to turn what is good into something bad. Now we shall have to repair a lot, but we shall still have to suffer from the maladies caused by the first moment when he has escaped us. So Metternich's feelings reveal another important point. Everyone, except apparently the Tsar, knew that Elba was a terrible idea. It was a dangerous place to put Europe's most dangerous man. Upon hearing of Napoleon's exile, the naval officer Graham Moore wrote in his diary, quote, Napoleon must be watched with the greatest circumspection. It is contrary to all probability that he can remain quiet. Stuart, as Castlereagh's half-brother, asked, quote, it might be well to consider before the act is irretrievable, whether a far less dangerous retreat might not be found, and whether Napoleon may not bring the powder to the iron mines which the island of Elba is so famed for. All right, point number 2. The British were almost entirely responsible for letting Napoleon escape from Elba. So we now know that Moore and Stuart were right, that Napoleon was a danger and would look to escape. But it should have been easy to prevent him from escaping. Some of the mistakes that led to his escape were committed by the Bourbons, so let me get those out of the way first. Louis XVIII decided, absurdly, not to pay Napoleon's designated annuity of 2 million francs. So Napoleon wasn't getting the money that he was expecting, and he compounded his error by confiscating Napoleon's substantial personal fortune. So Louis' general mismanagement combined with lingering Bonapartism soon made Napoleon think that if he could escape, he'd be well received, and in any case, he was just going to go broke if he stayed on Elba. So do something, anything to change the dynamic. But the British should have prevented him from escaping. So like a plane crash, there's not sort of one single mistake that caused Britain's failure here, but 3 mistakes sort of stand out. The first came, as before, from Castlereagh. Castlereagh seems to have come to terms with the Tsar's decision sooner than Metternich. Okay, fine, Elba. He was unable to come up with a better alternative. It was imperfect, but it was an answer to a difficult question, which is where to put Napoleon. Like you could execute him too, that would be another choice. But this was, an answer to the question, and it wasn't worth risking relations with the Tsar to fight the question of Elba. So on April 16th, he gave instructions to Colonel Neil Campbell to take up his post as, quote, commissioner on Elba. Note the significance of that term. Campbell was not Napoleon's jailer, and in fact, Castlereagh's orders to him suggest exactly the opposite. Campbell was to, quote, attend the late chief of the French government, end quote, ensuring that he's afforded, quote, every facility and protection. So Castlereagh even suggested that Napoleon may find the presence of a British officer, quote, of use in protecting the island and his person against insult or attack. He was Napoleon's bodyguard, not his jailer. Even Campbell was confused and asked for clarification in July, only to be told that he was, quote, the British resident in Elba without assuming any further official character. In Campbell's diary, he seemed aware that the rest of Europe assumed his orders were different. He says, quote, it is universally supposed in Italy and publicly stated that Great Britain is responsible to the other powers for the detention of Napoleon's person, and that I am the executive agent for this purpose. Napoleon believes this. So the key point here is that the Tsar and Castlereagh bungled things so badly that Napoleon didn't have to escape. He was the head of a sovereign state with an army and a navy, and the British guy there was there to protect him, not keep him there. Mistake number 2 brings us to this side of the ocean. So even if Castlereagh didn't think it was necessary to keep an eye on Napoleon, other British officials clearly did. It should have been easy for the Royal Navy to blockade Elba. After all, Elba was an island in the Mediterranean, and the Royal Navy was not only the strongest navy in the world, but also relatively stronger than at any other point in its history. It had more tonnage in 1815 than the rest of the world's navies combined. Surely it could secure an island in the Mediterranean. After all, it had for many years relied on islands like Elba to maintain its presence in that most important theater. So Minorca, Malta, not to mention the island-like fortress at Gibraltar. It had even captured Elba itself in 1796. So why did the Royal Navy fail to secure the island in 1815? The answer is that the Navy at the end of the Napoleonic Wars was staggering over the finish line. It was the most powerful Navy in the world, but it was also exhausted by 2 decades of war. Manning problems undermined planned deployments. Tired ships fell apart when inspected in dockyards. Ships built hastily out of green timber rotted. In the years after Waterloo, the Navy's strength declined sharply before a sustained rebuilding program in the late 1820s could be launched. Though the Navy was immensely strong on paper, it was in desperate need of peace to relieve the stresses on its ships, men, and dockyards. And more immediately, the problem in 1815 was that peace didn't arrive with Napoleon's abdication. Right? Hello, we're here. The War of 1812 entered its third year in June, and results were mixed from the British perspective. So initial success at Washington, burning the White House, etc., didn't lead to success at Baltimore. Invasion from Canada was halted, and American privateers were threatening trade even in the Irish Sea. So to try to tip the balance, the Admiralty committed significant resources to the North American theater as the war in Europe wound down. Over the course of 1814, an additional 5 ships of the line, 11 frigates, and 28 sloops transited the Atlantic. By December, more than 200 ships, so half the deployed ships in the Navy, were in the Western Hemisphere. After Napoleon's abdication, the War of 1812 was no longer a distraction from events in Europe. The commander-in-chief still complained to the Admiralty that he didn't have enough ships or men, which was a reasonable complaint given the length of the American coastline he had to patrol. But regardless of whether the forces in North America were sufficient, they were substantial, and the demands of the war meant that there were fewer ships available to guard Napoleon. But in any case, the fleet that bore responsibility for Elba's security had gone home. At the end of 1813, there were more than 31 ships of the line in the Mediterranean, which was more than in any other theater, and the entire command boasted more than 100 ships. But a year later, the end of 1814, 2 months before Napoleon's escape, there were just 5 ships of the line, 13 frigates and 14 sloops. Now that drawdown from over 100 to about 2 dozen was normal. The last time the Mediterranean fleet had been so weak was in 1803, which is to say during the last peace. Then, as in 1814, there were about 30 ships on station. All that ministers were doing in 1814 was returning the Navy to its normal peacetime deployment pattern, though they showed signs of wanting to draw it down even further. And the reason, of course, was money. Naval forces were enormously expensive to maintain while deployed, and the coffers were empty. The national debt had ballooned during the wars to more than 2.5 times British GDP, higher even than the debt to GDP ratio in the Second World War. The country was financially exhausted, and the only solution seemed to be drastic cuts to the military budgets. So Parliament slashed the 1815 naval budget to 64% of the budget for 1814, as estimated by the number of men voted, and the next year to 23% of its wartime high. Don't complain about budget cuts in today's world if you're getting slashed all the way to 23. Okay. So the result was that during the week of Napoleon's escape, there was just one sloop in the area, HMS Partridge, commanded by Commander John Miller Adye. Worse, his orders were not to blockade Elba, but rather to be in the area, quote, in case of any extraordinary circumstances. Between Castlereagh's orders to Campbell and Xmas orders to Adye, Britain ended up with the worst of all possible worlds, the appearance of security without the reality of it. Europe assumed Britain was watching Napoleon prevent his escape. It looked like that's what was happening, but in fact, that's not what was happening. That is not to say that none of this was Adye's fault. This was definitely partly Adye's fault, I should say. Mistake number 3 was definitely his. Partridge put into Elba on February 23rd, 1815, and preparations for Napoleon's expedition were everywhere. The Elban sloop, remember Napoleon had a little navy, had been repainted to look like a British vessel, which is an obvious sign that they're about to do something nefarious. On seeing Partridge's approach, Napoleon quickly ordered the Inconstant as the sloop to sea, but she was still visible when Partridge arrived, yet Adye noticed nothing amiss. Worse, a few days later, Partridge actually intercepted Napoleon's flotilla. Napoleon was intercepted at sea between Elba and France by Adye. It was a sloop and 6 troop ships after they made their escape, but Adye mistook Inconstant for a royalist French vessel and apparently didn't see the troop ships. So finally, when Adye realized his mistake, that whoops, that was Napoleon, he sailed for Naples in the wrong direction rather than France, because that's where they thought Napoleon would go. So this was not the Royal Navy's finest hour. I think it's essential to reflect on the reasons behind the historical failure to overlook these mistakes. That's the third thing I want to say. So NAM Roger, our esteemed supervisor, describes Napoleon's return like he's an athlete returning from a premature retirement. Quote, the 1814 peace treaty allowed Napoleon to retire as sovereign of the Italian island of Elba. It was not in his character, however, either to retire or keep his promises. In March 1815, he returned to France and forced Louis XVIII from his throne. Sounds like Michael Jordan coming back from playing baseball, basically. For Charles Esdale, it's a great adventure story. Quote, on 26 February, Napoleon sailed from Elba with his entire army of 750 men. Thus began the most extraordinary adventure of the entire Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. Landing on 1st of March near Frejus, Napoleon was soon on the march for Paris via Grenoble. Now, End quote. Now, I really don't mean to pick on the two of them, but they've written large leading surveys of the period, so I think it's fair to call them sort of representative of a general approach to this incident. That approach, in my opinion, is basically ahistorical. It reads the story backwards. Now, of course, we all do that. That's literally what historians do. But what I mean is that that approach describes Napoleon's escape, knowing that he failed at Waterloo. So the stakes are low. His escape was a mostly harmless episode in the broad sweep of the wars. What matters is that we need to set this great stage for the great Waterloo campaign. My point here is that part of our responsibility as historians is to put ourselves in the minds of those who didn't know the ending. And when we do that, in this case, I think a whole new picture of British incompetence and failure emerges. I don't think anyone's noticed that before, and that's why I published the article. The last historian to come close to this argument was Sir Charles Webster, writing a century ago. Right? The second problem with this sort of extraordinary adventure story is that it overlooks the immense cost and suffering of the 100 Days campaign. So 65,000 men died at Waterloo. It cost the French government 1.8 billion francs, or about 75 million pounds. The outcome of the battle wasn't preordained. Now, it's true that Napoleon's decision to return so early meant that his chances of success in the campaign were very low. There were too many Allied armies still in the field, totaling about 1 million men. Even if he'd won at Waterloo, it's not clear what the next steps might have been. But the campaign strained British finances too, and Napoleon had found himself in dire circumstances before. He'd gotten out of some tight scrapes, right? So we have to reintroduce uncertainty into this story. Most controversial thing I'll say is that I'm tempted to say that too many British historians, not necessarily Nicholas and Charles Ezio, but too many of them have overlooked the Elban failure because they were rooting for Napoleon to beat Wellington, or vice versa, for Wellington to beat Napoleon at Waterloo. There was a sense that, like, this is the great showdown. The two great generals of the age get to go fight each other, and so it's great that he escaped from Waterloo. That's probably a little unfair. So, but it did occur to me as I was researching this article that there's something there about the Waterloo sort of looms over all this, but they didn't know that. Anyways, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Well, on that note, well, first of all, thank you all for being here. You know who your friends are at an 8 o'clock session. So,
Will you pay us well?
yeah, exactly, right? So, okay, Aaron, we're all good?
All good.
Okay, thank you. There will be some overlap in this paper because I'm speaking about the escape from Elba and how it relates to activity that's going on in North America relative to the War of 1812. And so the goal of my paper is to connect two apparently unrelated events in two nominally separate wars. That is the exile of Napoleon to Elba, Napoleonic conflict, obviously, and the War of 1812, and the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, to show the interconnectedness of events happening on both sides of the Atlantic between April of 1814 and February of 1815. Now, ultimately, British failure at New Orleans can be traced back to the reactions of Lord Liverpool's government to the changing circumstances surrounding Napoleon's first abdication, and their effect on British foreign policy, both in Europe and in North America, and on domestic attitudes. And this is really important towards war and to things like taxation and to British national character. These had a direct impact on decision-making and adversely affected how the last big battle of War of 1812 is going to play out on January 8th of 1815. And so this paper examines the process by which British plans in North America were influenced and ultimately derailed by the threat of Napoleon's return. So the first 2 weeks of April in 1814 brought about three important events in the global conflict taking place. The first occurred on April 1st, when Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochran took command of the British Navy's North America station with every intention of escalating the war and bringing that war to a rapid close in Britain's favour. The second took place on April 6th, was the abdication of Napoleon Bonaparte after his defeat at the Battle of Paris, which so ably described. And he accepts the terms that are offered by Russia, Prussia, and Austria to go into exile and give up his empire. And, excuse me. And the third event that happened is actually in relationship to what happens in terms of perceptions of the meaning of the end to a continental war. Now, Great Britain is able to focus its attention on North America and siphon off troops and ships, theoretically, to go and escalate this war and aggressive action on the eastern seaboard. And so the third event is related directly to that, and that is Madison's lifting of the embargo. And this is an embargo that has been in place in various forms since about 1807. First of all, it's an effort to stave off US bankruptcy, which is on the brink of catastrophe, and rebellion in the Federalist Northeast. And he's looking for ways to boost revenue to meet this increased threat from Great Britain. So together, these events have addressed the worldwide scope of the war in 1814, and the degree of reciprocity in each of these suggests that there were two theatres in the same struggle, hinged on Great Britain and Britain's position as this imperial and commercial hegemon is facing a dual challenge, albeit from asymmetrical threats. Now, while Madison's ambition to emancipate Canada may have faded by this time, he could now focus on ways to break this slow strangulation of the US economy. And conversely, Liverpool's government, and there they are now free to craft an endgame in America, and his cabinet gets to work on the primary goal of securing Canada. It's always about Canada. Well, a series of diversions on the US coast, potentially ending in New Orleans, could prevent the Americans from massing forces in the north. Of course, Britain's uncertainty over the terms and conditions of Napoleon's exile certainly caused problems for planners in London. Elba was, of course, way too close, both in its proximity and its imperial worldviews, and the threat of Bonaparte's return is always looming over everything that happens throughout the entire rest of 1814. The rapidly changing political, diplomatic, and naval military circumstances on the continent also confused objectives in North America. And although Britain had long sought Madison's capitulation and a quick end to the war, Lord Liverpool was now less willing to negotiate moderate terms, now that he could devote more military and naval strength to what could be a punishing and crushing American defeat. Over the coming months, however, the means by which this victory would be achieved vacillated between small-scale coastal raids and full-blown military engagements, depending in part on the perceived threat of a Napoleonic restoration. In addition, action in North America had to be considered in relationship to talks that were going on in Europe with heads of state who were trying to remake the continent in Napoleon's way. And actions that would bolster the Crown's bargaining position in these negotiations, which were headed by Lord Castlereagh, and began officially on October 1st in Vienna, but unofficially began many, many months before that, also had to be considered. And with so many factors in play, confused and sometimes contradictory plans resulted in Whitehall, and then they devolved onto commanders like Cochran, who makes dubious or, at best, ill-informed decisions as a result in the field. And I think nowhere is this more evident than at New Orleans. So here's the chronology of how things kind of evolved and devolved in North America. So Cochran's assumption of command in North America saw 45 ships and vessels on station that he had in April, tasked with aggressive new policies. And those policies were designed to make life so unbearably awful for East Coast populations that those populations would put pressure on their government into ending the war. His plans for destructive flying attacks on East Coast towns and cities were combined with his predecessors' policies of blockade in both the Chesapeake and in New York. And these represented the diversionary half of Whitehall's plan to once and for all eliminate the threat to Canada. The other half of that plan was to send reinforcements to General George Prevost in Quebec, 30,000 reinforcements. But these reinforcements are not coming from the Duke of Wellington's Peninsular Army. Okay? Most of them actually come from Ireland and other home stations. Duke of Wellington, of course, and Lord Bathurst, the Secretary for War in the Colonies, were deeply sceptical of the security of Napoleon's prison, and they refused to release troops who might be needed for a moment's notice to resume hostilities in Europe. Of course, everyone was aware of the fragility of this Bourbon restoration and the unpopularity of Louis XVIII, both among Frenchmen and certainly among the Whig opposition back at home, who leveled heavy criticism against Lord Liverpool for his support of ancien regime despots, was one of the phrases I covered in the letters. At the Admiralty, Lord Melville too was hamstrung. Like his army colleagues, the First Lord understood the need to maintain the strength of the Channel Fleet and Mediterranean Fleet, although after April 14, Cochran's demands for more ships on the North America station were obvious. I mean, he needed more ships and more men to answer this lifting of the embargo. Melville knew that sending more ships to allow Cochran to extend and intensify his blockade was a necessary measure, even if it bled strength from home waters. And by the end of July, Cochran's demands were answered, and he commanded more than 70 ships, which are basically creating a continuous blockade all the way from the coast of Maine down to the Mississippi Delta. Now, this means that New Orleans is now in play. It is now a viable target. It had always been a target for Cochran, even before he was officially involved in the War of 1812, and so now planners in London are really starting to focus on it as an objective. And the capture of New Orleans could only help Britain's position in Canada and provide a powerful bargaining chip in negotiations with the Americans. Possession of the largest city in Louisiana was a hammer to hold over the heads of the US Congress to nail home British and European claims as to the illegality of the Louisiana Purchase, and in doing so threaten American expansion, particularly in the West. Simultaneously, such claims could also add weight to Britain's position in preliminary talks with Vienna. As the apparent defender of Spanish interests with respect to its Louisiana territory, Britain could leverage this position to gain Spain's acquiescence on anti-slave trading policies. These were a central part of these negotiations, and Liverpool was under a lot of pressure from abolitionists like William Wilberforce to make this happen. In addition, necessary, New Orleans could also be traded for potentially a new northern border or neutral zone. It might even also be useful for stymieing challenges to Anglo commercial dominance in the Western Hemisphere, maybe ceded in exchange for special trading privileges, and certainly it would satisfy the demands of British mercantilist interests in the West Indies. Capture of New Orleans presented such a multitude of possibilities that it became an immediate priority, and pressure was applied to Bathurst and Wellington to release troops for capture of the city. And after deliberation, they agreed. On April 27, Bathurst wrote to Wellington, confirming plans to send 7,500 troops to New Orleans under the command of Lieutenant General Rowland Hill. Now, the assignment of Wellington's, or one of his most trusted generals in the Peninsular War, spoke to the importance of this mission. The presence of Lord Hill also suggested that the campaign would be more than a hit-and-run attack. New Orleans was originally planned as a massed military operation of overwhelming force, overwhelming for the kind of force that they would be up against, they believed in New Orleans. And the Navy and the Army working in concert, Melville wrote to Cochran on July 29, authorizing him to proceed officially with plans for New Orleans. Now, unofficially, he had already begun this months before. He had started his advanced work on the Florida coast, and he had operatives down there who were reporting back to him that he could be assured, he could be guaranteed of the support of 3,000 disaffected Spaniards and Frenchmen, runaway enslaved people, and Creek Indians to form this colonial marine force. And so together with 7,500 regulars under Lord Hill, and as far as Cochran was concerned, success in New Orleans would be assured. By early August, however, the situation in London had changed. Spies on Elba are communicating news that Napoleon is interested in coming back, perhaps. And there's even one British newspaper which confirmed it as a fait accompli. That story was soon debunked, but nonetheless the fear remained. And the result was that Admiralty Secretary John Cochran writes to Cochran on August 10, announcing that circumstances no longer permitted the sending of 7,500 men under Lord Hill. Instead, he could count on 2,200 men under the command of Major General John Lambert. And what he could do was augment this force with whatever he had under General Robert Ross, who was already operating in Chesapeake. Now, as far as the Admiralty was concerned, if you added it all up, troops, sailors, Marines, you'd have about 6,000 men for this New Orleans campaign, and they felt that was completely okay. But it was a far cry from the 7,500 fresh troops under Lord Hill, and it meant that when the time came, all of Robert Ross's troops would not be available for the diversions that Cochran had planned in Georgia and in Florida, which Professor Smith has written extensively about. Cochran, nonetheless, at this point, remains sanguine. I mean, he still feels, okay, well, I've at least got those 3,000 Colonial Marines that I can count on, and we should be fine. September brought nothing but bad news in North America. Prevost's attempt to capture U.S. territory in the Northeast did not go as planned, to say the least. His invasion force descends on Lake Champlain and is defeated at the Battle of Plattsburgh, September 11. And a day later, in the opening salvos of a combined operation against Baltimore, Robert Ross is killed by a sniper. Now, the overall failure at Baltimore is something that Cochran feels very deeply and very personally, and I think it's easy to see that these dual specters of pride and vengeance are what propels him forward in the campaign for New Orleans, despite the vast reductions in support that's coming from him. Now, logistical and operational troubles dogged Cochran throughout September in the South, while ongoing negotiations in Ghent brought both sides no closer to resolution, and in fact adversely affected Britain's position in the preliminary talks for Vienna. A month later, when news of Plattsburgh reached British negotiators at Ghent, it was Henry Goulburn, who was Bathurst's deputy operating there, who felt confident that Prevost's failure in the north could be more than made up for by the capture of New Orleans, which he thought could be used to drive an equally hard bargain. Trading New Orleans for a new northern border or neutral buffer zone to protect Canada from future invasion, and a guarantee of land for Britain's Native American allies, and that's very important to him, was seen as the last best option to guard against this rapacious American expansionism. Now, November 20 sees the rendezvous of the first reinforcements for the New Orleans campaign, Point Negril in Jamaica. And Cochran's outlook by now had changed significantly. It was rather grim, because as he's assembling his forces from the Chesapeake and some from Bermuda, and the few he's actually gotten at this stage that have come from Britain, he realizes and understands that he is desperately short of men, because only 500 of the 3,000 promised colonial Marines had actually materialized. And Whitehall's alternative for sending more troops from Wellington's stock was to tell Cochran to go and get them from Prevost. And so he sends pleas and many letters up to Prevost saying, look, can you please release one battalion for southern operations? And this is at a time of year when nothing could be done in the north. Well, those pleas fell on deaf ears. Furthermore, Cochran's request to the Admiralty for 25 to 30 flat-bottomed vessels to use as landing craft to get across the shallow lakes surrounding New Orleans, well, they were ignored. On top of that, intelligence leaks in Jamaica alerted the Americans to plans for his attack on the Gulf Coast. And what he was really worried about was that the war would be over before Cochran had been able to, as he said, give the Americans a good drubbing. And this is what rushes him into action. As far as he was concerned, his only chance was to strike before the Americans had a chance to formulate a defense of any kind. He began the campaign with roughly 4,000 regulars and West India regiments and about 1,000 Marines, about 9 battleships and a couple of dozen frigates and transports, but with no flat-bottom boats for the use as landing craft, no mobile artillery or artillery transports. This is something Codrington really rails about, both before and after the campaign. Insufficient provisions, and without, of course, the senior army commander for the campaign. And Major General Sir Pakenham would not arrive in Louisiana until December 25th. Back home, the government's involvement in European policymaking was deeply unpopular and feeds a lot of political domestic unrest and a growing disdain for the American war. It's hard to see the dialogue here, but you can see John Bull about to be executed, sacrificed on the pyre of sacred Bourbon causes. And the butcher himself over here on the left is none other than Prime Minister Lord Liverpool himself. He's Castlereagh prevaricating, trying to convince the Bull it's all okay. Meanwhile, the Exchequer, with new war taxes on his axe, is literally decapitating Britons, while Napoleon masses his forces in the background. Sums up the whole mood. Now, Liverpool did acknowledge that while continuing the war, with North America for another year would certainly yield better results for Britain. The weight of domestic and continental factors necessitated an immediate settlement at Ghent, which was signed on December 24th. And on December 13th, the Prince Regent ratified the treaty. This is a week before the Battle of New Orleans takes place, and Croker sends a letter to Cochran recalling him to England, contingent, of course, upon an American ratification. Cochran wouldn't receive this order until February, by which time the magnitude of the defeat at New Orleans was well known in both England and Europe. Cochran's failure at New Orleans ended his career at sea. He was an obvious and easy target to shoulder the burden of what was a very unsatisfying end to this American war. The disaster at New Orleans was, however, the product of many factors, only some of which had to do with Cochran. First, Bathurst, Wellington, and Melville, they constantly altered the nature and size of the Louisiana campaign, which began as a full-scale military operation. Weeks later, it's slashed to the size of an outside raid, and then it's resurrected as a kind of half-baked invasion force, minus elements essential to its success, like artillery and boats. These fluctuations in grand strategy were partly dictated by speculation as to Napoleon's willingness to cooperate in his own exile, because after all, that's exactly what it is. Partly in answer to criticism from Whig opposition at home, and partly in accordance with pressure from European negotiators in Vienna. And among Britons themselves, public support for the government founded as demands grew for tax reform, an end to British involvement in continental policy, and a cessation of the war against an enemy who many now referred to as their American cousins. How things had changed. And just as the campaign for New Orleans formed in the confluence of three simultaneous events in April 18, it ended in a series of three related actions in the last 2 weeks of February 1815. First, Cochran left the Gulf Coast in defeat and disgrace, despite having had no part in the military events which actually handed what was a British victory over to General Jackson. That's another story. Second, Madison ratified the peace, leaving his nation bankrupt and whole, and threats of those Federalist secessions they evaporated with the resumption of commerce. And Jackson's success against the might of Great Britain provided the foundations for claims of an American victory in the war itself, which very conveniently ignored years of rather crushing defeats, and they focused instead on the frigates, the fort, and New Orleans to frame this new nationalist narrative. The third event, of course, was the escape of Napoleon. He makes his break from Elba on February 26, triggering a new war with Britain and the continental allies. And one thing that did happen, I think, in contrast to the factionalism and infighting that's going on at Vienna, this 100 days really does galvanize a new coalition who sort of comes together in a more true concept of Europe to try and defeat the common foe. So to sum up, the entanglement of international politics and diplomacy that played out on the world stage in the months between Napoleon's first abdication and his ill-fated return to power provided both the motivation and the means by which naval and military events unfolded in North America. Connectivity between world powers and its effect on both foreign policy and domestic affairs in Britain influenced wartime decision-making, which, in the case of New Orleans, yielded decisive but unwanted results.
All right, very good, very early morning from the West Coast. As John very kindly introduced me, my name is Commander Josh Weiss, and I will be speaking today on the effects of Napoleon's return and the subsequent 100 days on the British Army and the Royal Navy in the West Indies. The presentation is drawn from work I did for the Graduate Certificate in Maritime History program at the Naval War College during the 2020-2021 academic year, so I'm very used to talking to people on computers right now. The original work focused heavily on applying the modern concept of mission command to the age of sail and to produce useful lessons for modern practitioners and historians. While mission command will play a part of my talk today, it's not the true focus. Instead, as the title implies, I want to talk to you today about an overlooked area and an otherwise heavily studied part of history. First, Please bear with me on the maps. They are obviously not period accurate, but they're a very, very useful tool to illustrate the story and to avoid the stereotypical naval officer's desire to fill slides with words and then read those words right back to you. The time frame from my story kind of picks up, where Evan and Sam left off. It's the first 8 months of 1815 with a heavy emphasis on March through August. So as we've kind of talked about in general, for background, at the beginning of the period, the world compared to the previous 20 years is a relatively peaceful place. Napoleon is defeated. He's in Elba. In Vienna, the Allies are working on reshaping the modern world, and with respect to the West Indies, continuing the perennial reshuffling of colonial ownership through the Treaty of Paris that has been going on for the past, honestly, about 60 years at this point. As Sam just got done talking about, for the West Indies perspective, the War of 1812 at this point in March is starting to wind down. Specifically, more to my project, I focused in on the Leeward Islands. Specifically, again, the now returned to the French islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. If you're familiar with it, right, both of these islands have a history of being competed over, taken, and then returned through the long 18th century. The general pattern being that hostilities break out, Britain will capture them, and then they'll be returned either for some concession or another. So that's what happened here. Both islands were taken by the British in 1810, and both were given back to France in the Treaty of Paris. So 1 March 1815 finds the islands newly restored to the House of Bourbon. And so, as we just talked about, while the Treaty of Ghent was ratified on February 17th, that news has not yet reached this area. And American privateers are very much still out preying on British shipping in the area. Just to give you some background on the major players of the story, we'll start with this guy right here, Rear Admiral Sir Charles Philip Durham. He's Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy Forces in the Leeward Islands. Excuse me. At this point, he's been there for a little over a year. His principal concerns right now are protecting the British trade from those American privateers. As again, Sam talked about and Evan talked about, he is also concerned with drawing down a degraded and tired squadron. The ships that can still float, that can still sail, are needed elsewhere, and he's being semi-heavily pressured by Lord Melville back in London to send what he has, what can float, what can sail, to other places. He's also very concerned with ending what to this point had actually been a very successful naval career. He's basically run out of things he thinks he can do that make him feel like his reputation is being bolstered. So much so that he's actually written to Melville asking to be relieved. And Melville, prior to March 1st, has said, "Yep, I've got you a relief. He's on his way. You can come home and you can continue on with your career." So he's one of the principal actors in the story. For the British Army, didn't say Royal. For the British Army, General Sir James Leith is the governor of the Leeward Islands. He too has been there for just about a year at this point. A veteran of the Peninsula Campaign, and as pointed out for New Orleans, right? Much like Cochran couldn't, it is important to note that although Leith is the governor, he has no real authority over Durham. So much like in New Orleans, there we go, right? He can't swim far enough to get to Guadeloupe or Martinique, which will become important. On the French side, you have right here, Pierre-René Marie de Vaugirard de Rosnay, the Comte de Vaugirard. He's the newly installed Bourbon governor of Martinique. In fact, he's only been there for about 4 months at this point, and he's a staunch royalist. So much so, in fact, that at the beginning of the revolution, he resigned his commission and spent the ensuing 24 years in exile in London. On Guadeloupe, you have the Vice Admiral Charles Alexander Durand, the Comte de Lanois. He is the newly installed Bourbon governor of Guadeloupe, and a very interesting character. Nowhere near as staunch a royalist as the Comte de Vaugirard. In fact, he saw service in the Bourbon, Revolutionary, and Bonapartist navies, seeing most of his significant service in action with the latter two. His previous active career came to an end when he was actually captured by the British in 1810. That's the background on the major players. So how does Mission Command fit in? Mission Command fits in because of the 4,000 nautical mile, or about 5 to 6 week travel time for orders to get from the ministers and secretaries to the commanders-in-chief on station. So the First Lord, Lord Melville, and the Secretary of State for War and Colonies, Bathurst, left and right here, would be those two relevant secretaries for the two commanders-in-chief, the British commanders-in-chief that I spoke to. To give you, since I've mentioned it twice now without giving you background, mission command, for those of you who are not familiar, is a command and control philosophy characterized by trust between senior and junior leaders and independent execution of orders based around a common understanding of purpose and intent. It's designed to leverage the benefits of commanders on scene, taking advantage of local circumstances. So looking at this map, looking at this distance, even though the term itself is an anachronism, the ideas behind our modern phrase very much in play here. And then even more so, given that date that I started this with and kind of the theme of this panel, right? So on March 1st, Napoleon lands at Cannes. We all know that. We've all talked about that, setting the whole continent on fire and ushering in the 100 days. As I alluded to at the beginning, most historiography out there focuses on what happened on the continent and in the UK, or with respect to the War of 1812. Very little attention has been paid to what has happened all the way back in the West Indies. In fact, as far as I can tell, there's been no independent comprehensive analysis of the events that occurred on Guadeloupe and Martinique. I say no independent analysis exists because what little modern scholarship has tackled this subject relies on accounts that are either supplied directly from Admiral Durham or were very heavily influenced by him. And that becomes very important very soon. So as we've covered, so I'll go a little faster through this. March through May on the continent is dominated by the response to Napoleon's return. Publicly, the allies of the forming Seventh Coalition are staunch in their opposition to Bonaparte's return. The Seventh Coalition is ratified 13 March. Napoleon declared an outlaw the same day. Treaty of Vienna for opposing him is reaffirmed on 25 March. Privately, the British government is extremely confused about what's happening on the continent, and has been discussed in the two previous papers. While it appears firm in its resolve publicly to oppose Napoleon, it's extremely indecisive about how to go about achieving that, especially given Louis XVIII's very quick collapse and flight. As an example, again, to speed through this, is when Castlereagh gives instruction to the diplomats on the continent to reassure Louis XVIII that the French region is dedicated to keeping him on his throne, that's not what's going on behind the scene. The British government is very concerned about the tenability of the French government, of the Bourbon government, I should say, and the French people's willingness to accept it. They're very worried about the cost of recommitting troops and building up yet another regime that will not stand the test of any real adversity. So after the initial shock wears off, the ministers in England and France begin to communicate to their commanders-in-chief in the Leeward Islands. And it's important to understand this debate that was going on in the background, as it informs the orders that both Melville and Bathurst will send to their commanders in the Leeward Islands. On the French side, this happens as well. So the Comte de Chartres writes to the Count of Lenoir around 24 March, letting him know the king has fled to Lille. Apparently that the king was considering retiring to Guadeloupe if this whole Europe thing doesn't work out in the end. And he also gives him a very important order, an order to not allow any new forces to enter Guadeloupe or hand over the administration to anyone without the order of the king, countersigned by Chartres himself. Also, remembering Lenoir's checkered background of service in the Revolutionary and Bonapartist Navy, Louis directs that the Comte de Vaugirard, the governor of Martinique, and the guy who went to London for 24 years rather than give up on his king, be appointed Governor General of the Leeward Islands, making him technically Lenoir's superior. On the Royal Navy side, Melville writes two letters of importance to Durham. The first one says, hey, I know you want to come home. I know you want to move on, but you can't, right? I've canceled your relief until there's peace. The second, he writes on 26 March, and is arguably the more important of the two, directs him to abstain from any hostilities against Bonaparte's flag unless the vessels which carry it commit acts of aggression or you hear of war commencing. For Leith on the army side, Bathurst writes on 10 April with instructions to, hey, I want you to support the French authorities to maintain the authority of Louis XVIII. That's not even that much of a simplification. That's effectively the order he gives him. based on packet schedules and that 4,000-mile transit, most of these orders will not make it to the West Indies until late May, very quickly on the heels of Napoleon's return. I'm sorry, the news of Napoleon's return. So that's the heart of the story with respect to Mission Command. Yeah, and we'll move on. So word of the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent gets to Durham on 28 March. So this is good for him, right? Not yet knowing what's going on in Europe, his concern about the privateers starts to fade. But it doesn't totally remove that threat because there is a burn down period in that treaty. Additionally, what few ships he hasn't sent home and that are still floating are employed still in moving British troops around the region as part of the colonial reshuffling of the Treaty of Paris, all the way up till as late as the 1st of May. News of Napoleon's return gets to Barbados on 28 April. And then by 6 May, Durham writes to the Admiralty and says, hey, I'm not going to send you any more ships unless you make me, because I may actually need these. For the French authorities, things are going downhill on Guadeloupe and Martinique, just like they are at home. So much so that by May 11th, the Comte de Lanois writes to Leith asking for a British ship to cruise around the colonies to prevent any Bonapartist ships coming from the continent from getting there and bringing that news or bringing inflammatory orders. Both governors continue to face, both French governors continue to face increasing pressure from their garrisons and populations, again, so much so that Vaugirard at the end of May writes to Leith and actually asks him to send British troops to occupy the forts on Martinique and help him maintain the authority of Louis XVIII. On 28 May, Durham will write home informing the Admiralty, informing Lord Melville that Leith has this 10-order communication from Bathurst directing cooperation with the French authorities, that Vaugirard has asked for that help and that he's going to help provide transport. On the 31st, Durham writes that they make the same offer to Lanois, who refuses the assistance. Durham's opinion of why Lanois refuses the assistance is he does not think that Lanois' government or his administration would survive if word that they asked for the British help to come back. So through his reports back to the Admiralty, it is clear that around the end of May, Admiral Durham is very uncomfortable with the situation in front of him. He just got done with the War of 1812. He was awaiting relief to return home. Now, with the reduced and decaying squadron, he is facing the possibility of a renewed world war, one that could see his reputation, which was built on protecting merchant shipping, destroyed. As a consequence, he begins to take a very hard line on interpreting Melville's direction to engage in no hostilities unless the French act first or he hears of war actually commencing, in line with what Lord Melville wrote to him. So by June 6th, British troops have occupied the forts on Martinique in the name of the French governor and Louis XVIII, and Durham is making arrangements with Vaugirard to ship the troops with Bonapartist sympathies back home. On 10 June, it's clear that Durham is getting more frustrated. General Leith, Vaugirard, and Lanois are becoming more and more concerned with Bonapartist activities, the threat of news or reinforcements coming from the mainland, and they are pressing Durham. They're pressing him to help. They're pressing him to use his ships because, again, the army can't swim that well, and the French don't have a royalist naval presence in the area. So they need Durham. They need him to help, and they are pressing him to oppose the tricolored flag. Durham, however, has no interest in this. He writes back to the admiral saying, hey, because of those orders you gave me on 26 March, I'm resisting applications by Leith, Vaugirard, and Lanois to be hostile to the tricolor flag. But don't worry, because it hasn't actually shown up in the area yet. So, of course, 3 days later, it does. Right. One of Durham's ships stops a sloop called La Gilles, and the Bourbon flag on there is not a mistake. When they stop it, it's flying the white flag of the Bourbons. Upon further investigation, however, Durham finds out that it is actually under orders to do that when approaching the coast, and it is, in fact, carrying orders from Napoleon's government for the governors and warships in the area to rally to the Bonapartist government. Understanding what he has in his hand, but also understanding or too strictly interpreting Melville's orders, Durham sends the packet of inflammatory papers and orders to Admiral Lanois on Guadeloupe and says, hey, I stopped this sloop. It's got a Bonapartist flag on board. It's got a tricolor. It's got these orders. What do you want me to do? Lanois says, I want you to get rid of them. I want you to send the sloop down to Martinique. I want you to ask my now governor general, my now superior, Valjerad, what does he want me to do? Durham considers this, and instead he gives the dispatches back to the captain and lets La Gille go on her merry way. And of course, where does La Gille go? She goes straight to Guadeloupe and drops those off. On June 18th, Durham goes to check on Guadeloupe, perhaps understanding that he has just made a mistake by allowing this information to reach the island, and of course finds the tricolor flag flying on all the forts. He sends an officer ashore to offer Lenoir protection. Lenoir declines it, and by this point, on June 18th, the island declares its loyalty to Bonaparte. Valjerad, again, now the governor of the French islands and the West Indies, all of them, applies to Leith for help in retaking Guadeloupe. Remembering that, neither he nor his troops can swim far enough to get to Guadeloupe, Leith goes to Durham and says, hey, I need your help. I need you to ferry troops. I need you to protect us from any other Bonapartist warships in the area. Right, so there we are. Now it belongs to the French, the Bonapartists. So from 30 June to 11 July, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but Leith and Durham exchange in a 7-letter, very remarkable exchange. It starts with Leith expressing his desire to retake the Saints, which are these little islands just to the south of Guadeloupe here. But it fully expands to retaking Guadeloupe itself. Durham continues to refuse. Leith's letters to Durham are characterized by the idea of mission command. He has orders from Bathurst that allow freedom of action towards an intent. If you remember, all Bathurst told him was, hey, I want you to support the French government when they ask, so that you can still do your mission. Leith alternately pleads with, argues with, and attempts to shame Durham into taking action now to avoid worse consequences later. Durham remains obstinate for the whole thing. Only when Lenoir's forces leave voluntarily from the Saints does he agree to ferry British troops there. He remains, however, unmoved with respect to Guadeloupe. He refuses to take any action and effectively clings to those March 26 orders that prevent him from, effectively, as he sees it, starting hostilities. The argument eventually devolves to the level of comparing dates on whose ministers sent which orders most recently. And along this line, Durham goes so far as to make reference to other orders that urge a cautious line of conduct. However, it's very likely that he was at best bending the truth with these respective orders. I was unable to find any copy of these orders that survive today. However, copies of Durham's correspondence logs do survive today, and I have looked at those, and they don't corroborate his story. Interestingly, Durham lying to protect his reputation is very much in line with his reputation at the time. In fact, according to his modern biographer, whenever George III heard a particularly outlandish statement, he would apparently refer to it as a Durham. So this does kind of check with chart when it comes to the admiral's personality. So back to the story. On July 10th, in the midst of a letter to the Admiralty complaining that Leith is treating him terribly and pushing him to act contrary to Melville's orders, Durham finally receives a series of instructions from Melville telling him to commence hostilities and to cooperate with Leith. To his credit, at this point, Durham immediately complies. Okay, so the events after July 11th are actually pretty anticlimactic. Durham moves quickly to cooperate with Leith, and by 10 August, Lenoir has surrendered to a British and Royalist invasion force on Guadeloupe. The fighting is actually pretty minimal. There's not a lot of casualties. Lenoir and his deputy are sent home to France to face trial. Lenoir himself is exonerated. His deputy is actually sentenced to death, but this too is actually eventually commuted. In fact, there are no real consequences for anyone involved. Durham gets his relief. Admiral John Harvey comes out and relieves Admiral Durham. He gets to go home, continues on in his naval career, becomes a member of Parliament, and lives another 30 years of a pretty good life. Leith continues on as before as the Governor General, although he does die of fever on Barbados in 1816. Interestingly, neither Leith nor Durham ever appear to publicly address their argument. Both write glowing reports of the others to their ministers. In the end, it's easy to see why these events have escaped scholarly analysis. There were no real consequences for any of the players, and the events didn't impact the war writ large. The story, however, definitely warrants being told. Had events in Europe played out differently, the political situation in the West Indies would likely have seen the area fester as an area of conflict. Additionally, the conflict between the two commanders-in-chief themselves, the British commanders-in-chief, is remarkable by itself. Finally, there also remains significant room for further scholarship here, particularly with respect to the events that occurred on Guadeloupe from the time of the news of Napoleon's return reaching there until they declared for the emperor themselves on June 18th, which of course is the same day he lost the Battle of Waterloo. And that's all I have. Thank you.
We'll begin with questions, but first I'd like to start with a short discussion perhaps we can get into before we get into your questions. This is almost a century ago that Sir Julian Corbett, in his Creighton lecture, commented on the need to study the post-1805 period of the Napoleonic Wars. And it's taken us almost a century to get to that point. The last 10 years, we've been able to really open up this area. The work of James Davey and others and our scholars here have done a great deal to that. You've heard some really fine scholarship today, first rate, from all three of our speakers. But I'm worried, in the last session I was attended last night, the point was made that we historians who like to do subtle history, deep analysis, great detail, are unable to communicate to senior officers in the Navy. And the suggestion was made that, well, what you need to do is to speak in the patois, the naval patois, of the PowerPoint slide. And what would you use to your approach in your papers to make a couple of points that would either draw a senior flag officer, an ordinary flag officer, not a Stavridis or a Madison or a Stansfield Turner who would love this sort of thing, but ordinary flag officer, general officer, to think about if you would draw them into your paper or to summarize your paper precisely. I'll start with Josh. What do you think you would do in that regard?
Oh, thanks, John. In that regard, I would use as little words or no words as.
Very small words.
I mean,
Yeah.
you get there. There's rules, right? No more than 3 bullets per page. No more than 1 sentence per bullet. But if you want the admiral's attention, you got to hit him with the bottom line up front, and it basically needs to be no more than 1 slide.
Right. So what would you say on your paper? What would you put?
I understand. Awesome. And so you read it, so you'll understand the background. But I would have in my paper, I used a mission command filter that I developed to kind of dig some big lessons out. I would have 2 bullets, and the first one would say words matter, and I would talk to Melville's orders and his obfuscation, his confusing wording. I would talk to Bathurst's orders, which basically said, I want you to keep the Bourbon government in power. I don't particularly care how you do it. And then along the same lines, that the second bullet would say intent matters. So I'd give you words matter and intent matter. And that second one would be more of, you need to explain to your subordinates why you want something done. And it's not clear that Bathurst and Leith did that, although they got the right answer out of it. It's absolutely clear that Durham did not understand Melville's intent. Melville's intent, from reading through it and with the benefit of 200 years of hindsight, is that he didn't want another theater of conflict open. He was worried about, the end of the War of 1812. He was worried about the state of the Royal Navy and its ability to fight another world war. He didn't want to start a conflict again in the West Indies. In no way, shape, or form did he want Admiral Durham to allow Bonaparte's forces to take Guadeloupe. So that's how I would do that.
Good. Heather or Sam, you want to comment?
My turn? You want to go?
Sure, I'll go.
Okay.
If I had to narrow it down to one PowerPoint with a couple of points on it, it would be, well, first of all, communication. Obviously, communication is far easier in this day and age than it was in the 19th century, but there are still issues about understanding overall intent. And the issue of mission command, even at the level of someone like Cochran, who is having to make these big decisions in the field, I mean, he needs to understand what is going on back at home. What is the larger political objective going on here? And then the other factor would be contingency planning. You know, what are you going to do if your primary services are going to be stripped away from you? What is your backup plan? Because I think so much was riding on Cochran's understanding of his 3,000 colonial Marines and what he was getting from home. And when it didn't materialize, I don't think he sufficiently planned ahead to see how he could make up these differences. And there's a vast underestimation of the enemy here going on too. So wider communication from an overall overarching sort of perspective, and then on the ground contingency planning in terms of the actual operators.
So this is a hard assignment, but I'll see what I can do. I would say senior officers like to talk about whole of government approaches. That's a sort of buzzword. Here's an example of an actual failure of a whole of government approach. This is why it's needed. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you can see, like, I could probably talk to a senior officer about the importance of allies and all that stuff, and I think that's maybe part of this. But I think the British can survive having put Napoleon on Elba if the whole government is on the same page about whether he's a prisoner there and what they're going to do to keep him there. And they don't, clearly they're operating at cross purposes. The Navy gets pulled out and they don't actually treat him as a prisoner. So a whole of government approach, this is an example of an actual failure of a whole of government approach, and it's why it matters. That buzzworthy enough for you, John?
Answer the challenge. Yeah.
In the patron.
Yes, sir.
Let's open up for other comments, questions.
So I have a comment and a question following Evan's tradition. So the comment would be more along Charles Esdale. Well, I appreciate you describing British failure. As a French historian, it's always wonderful to hear.
Yes.
And part of the reason you won't see Charles Esdale write anything negative because he's such an apologist for what Britain's doing. So, you know, I think you're right. You may be setting up the Waterloo battle, but part of it is Britain can do no wrong for Charles. The question for actually both you and Sam is that you guys talk about a lot about what's going on in North America, which is important in drawing off resources. At the same time, you start to have the Polish-Saxon crisis, right? Where now you have, you know, actually England and Austria, as well as like looking to bring France into an alliance against Russia. And so like, do you see, while we all know about the forces being sent off to North America, is that leading in part also to maybe drawing the forces towards the Baltic in that time frame? Do we see that as a redeployment?
I think I remember reading one thing about this in which the point was made that the Polish-Saxon crisis is exactly the kind of continental crisis in which the British can talk a big game but can't actually do much. And
Right.
it's the continental powers are pretty quick to say, like, what are you going to do about this? This is not. So I don't see the Polish-Saxon crisis as driving naval deployment necessarily. But it's certainly part of the broader issue of the fragility of the Allied coalition.
Right,
And it's
right.
among the reasons why you're just going to let the Tsar make the mistake of
Right.
putting him on Elba and then say, okay, well, let's just deal with the consequences rather than pick a fight with him about having, you know, trying to move Napoleon once you've got him there. It's like, oh, that's a problem that is solved. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is Polish-Saxon crisis. Okay, what are we going to do with there?
Right.
We've solved the Napoleon problem. But again, there's, to go back to John's little buzzword thing, there's not a whole of government response here. Parts of the British government solved the Napoleon problem, and other parts weren't clear that it had been solved. Yeah.
I think the other factor of that too is just political concerns, straight up domestic British political concerns, and the fact that Liverpool is desperately frightened that his government's about to fall, and that a lot of decision making is happening in the wake of these new coalition, these new kind of axes that are developing on the continent, and yet he's still worried about just his livelihood as a politician in Britain. And British domestic factors, I think, are critically important to everything that happens here.
And it explains like the 80% budget cut.
Right.
That's real money.
Right. Well, I was going to, when you mentioned that.
John,
Oh, I'm sorry, John.
I'll refer you, John.
John.
Oh my God, too many Johns. Anyway, no, what you just said, Sam, and you're talking about whole government approach. One thing you didn't say is the domestic situation in England. So that would be a point for a general officer. And I would just make a comment here. Back in, I was.
Is this a C story?
Please,
Can,
yes.
can
No.
you deliver it in bullet points?
Well, that's, as a former PowerPoint ranger.
Yes.
Okay, in the intel side of the house. They're too busy to read. I was doing some research. I was involved in the first violation of the Incident at Sea Agreement in 1972. And I went into NHHC's classified archives, and I was trying to find in the CNO's daily brief if there was a reference to it. Now, this is when Zumwalt was, right? Too busy to read bullets. Those beautiful daily briefings were in full paragraph form, beautifully written. I mean, done within hours. Zumwalt was too busy to read. Today, it's a bullet. You know, it's absolutely ludicrous. But that's my C story.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that I'm trying to figure out how I could phrase this as a question.
That's all right, bring it on.
It seems to me that all three papers have some commonalities beyond the ones that you pointed out. First of all, and this is something I see, an issue that seems to me comes up with other panels, is the choice of humans. Durham may not have been an ideal choice for that command at that time, but the guy on the sloop in the Mediterranean definitely wasn't the ideal guy for the command at that time. But who's his senior? And how is that senior selected? So it seems to me, in a situation where communications are slow, and you're going to have a good deal of autonomy for the guy on the spot, it seems to me absolutely crucial, it should have been absolutely crucial to select people who are going to be on the spot, who can exercise some sort of autonomy and understand the spirit of the instructions, which obviously, particularly in Josh's case, was simply not done. The other point that seems to me, thread that seems to me that's going through this is logistics. Where's Elba being blockaded or watched from? In the Mexican War, David Connor had to improvise a landing force of flatboats for Winfield Scott's forces, but they got 8,600 guys ashore. Cochran, I assume, didn't have the logistical ability to do something like that himself in the Caribbean. So instead, he's saying to the admiral to get maybe flat bottom boats, and I wonder how they're going to get them across the Atlantic, to be perfectly honest. But it seems to me that there are some logistical constraints in all the cases of all three papers. I'm going to stop there, and if any of you want to speak to those issues,
Josh, go first.
Shoot away.
Yeah, that I'll speak to your first point, and you're absolutely right. I will counter a little bit in saying that, especially in the case of not knowing that Napoleon was going to escape, sometimes you're stuck with the guy you got on scene, right?
Bingo.
And the important part there is the commander issuing the orders, to go back to the mission command idea, has a responsibility to understand his subordinate on station. And it's very clear that Melville did not understand the effect of his recension of Durham's relief that it had on Durham, nor did he understand or likely think through and how Durham might respond to, one, that cancellation of his relief, and two, the very narrow wording. So that is another very, very important piece of the filter I developed in the larger piece of the commander. Sometimes you're just stuck with the dude, right? You have to have an understanding of when he's going to need to be pushed and when he's going to need to be held back.
Right. It's fascinating to talk about personalities. I'll talk about both the officers involved and then the logistics, because the backstory about who's there, I don't know how Adia gets his job. I don't know how that comes to be.
Right.
But I do know who his bosses were. And that's a fascinating story because the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean who originally issues the orders to keep a sloop on station in case of extraordinary circumstances is the A-team. That's Exmouth, Pellew, right? The famous figure. This is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
But the minute that Napoleon is abdicated, Exmouth is like, I'm out. Yeah, I'd like a relief, and he heads home. So they put the junior varsity, so to speak, in charge, which is a couple of fairly distinguished officers, but they're not Exmouth. They're not one of the, the great captains of his day, and neither one of them changed the orders that are given to the sloop. So I suspect that they were just sort of like, one of them basically spends most of his time sort of drifting down the map of Italy is very helpful there. Drifting down the coast by Naples, and he ends up in the whirlpool of Charybdis, and he's sort of writing in his journal about how he's with his family, and oh, isn't this lovely, and we're going on our sort of Mediterranean cruise, and then he finds out that Napoleon's escaped. He's like, oh crap, that's panic stations, but he had no sense of like what Ade was doing or how he was going about doing his business, because this is it's supposed to be a sort of peacetime gig. It's a very desirable command to get the Mediterranean in peacetime.
It's not simply as a nice place to be, although Malta is apparently fairly uncomfortable.
Right.
But also in terms of prestige of overseas.
Right. So about logistics. So I suspect that if the commander had understood the mission, talking about mission, command, and intent, and understanding how do you actually communicate orders, clearer orders to the sloop to say your job is keep Napoleon on the island.
Right.
May have overcome some of the logistical difficulties because they do actually have a sloop there on the spot who should have prevented it from happening.
Yeah, but the command failure begins in London.
It does, but and that's because they don't give the orders to actually keep them there on Elba. But I don't think that logistics would have overly constrained them in terms of being able to put a ship off the coast of Elba pretty regularly.
I tend to think about logistics from the steam era, and it's a whole other ballgame.
They would have been capable of putting more than one ship off of Elba for some period of time. I think even in the peacetime drawdown, that's sort of impossible. So most of the Navy board correspondence in this period is all about how please stop buying stuff. We've got too much stuff in the dockyards and we're just overflowing with supplies. So there's definitely stuff around. They don't I don't think have to worry too much about keeping a sloop in the area. The problem is the orders to the sloop that are not clear, and then an understanding of whether Napoleon's actually in jail.
In terms of Cochran, I think in terms of personality, he was probably not the right choice because he's just such a volatile character. But in terms of his operational chops, he had them. I mean, he's kind of made something of a name for himself as a man who is good at combined operations. He's constantly working with the army. Just a few years previously, he's taken Martinique and Guadeloupe working with the army, and so here he is in command of the station as sort of the overall combined operations commander. And when he's got Robert Ross with him, he's working pretty well.
Yeah.
But when he's on his own, I think that all these factors that I talked about start to come into play. And in terms of his logistics, and Codrington, who's sort of his, I guess, second in command at New Orleans, writes about this after the fact and talks about that, he knew that they had dozens of these Dutch shoots and doggers back in England, and that was the kind of boat that they were asking for, and they'd asked for it very much in advance. As soon as New Orleans was even an idea, they wanted these boats sent over to Jamaica, and they could have just been put on top of a transport. I mean, it wouldn't have been a difficult logistical program if they had begun early. But the problem here is resources in transport ships, right?
Yeah, and amongst logistics ultimately is the sinews of war.
Exactly.
And the domestic.
And the domestic
political
factor,
situation regarding
100%.
taxation
And so he makes up for it by using ship's tendons. That's what he uses for the landing craft, and they're just, they're small. They're still fairly deep drafted for these really shallow legs. And he makes it work though. I mean, he gets them there. It's not easy. The weather doesn't cooperate. It's freezing cold, but he makes it work. But it is an extremely difficult campaign from where they're approaching to get to the city of New Orleans.
The British don't have a big good base in the Caribbean for attack on the Gulf.
No, they don't. And his original plan was to come through Mobile, but he had to take Mobile in order to do that, and they can't take Port Boyer at the mouth of Mobile Bay, and so that idea goes out the window. And then So now it's all about trying to come through the lakes. But he had suspected that, and he thought ahead, knowing that that may be an issue, but it was just a matter of the Admiralty's opportunity cost, you know, and what else had to be achieved.
Thank you. All three of you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
My thought is my question is not as well thought out as these gentlemen. I've always wondered how Napoleon escaped Elba. And I guess I'll just ask a couple quick questions. You mentioned Napoleon had a stipend from Louis XVIII in the treaty, did his imperial guard. How do you board 750 imperial guardsmen? And I didn't know there were 6 or 7 because the movie Waterloo only shows a big 3-masted ship sailing from Elba. How do you board that without British spies, which I think Sam mentioned? Understanding that, you know, even if spies did report on it, you're not getting it back to the UK quick enough. And then finally, yesterday I was at a panel on Royal Navy punishments of their commanding officers when they failed in investment.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know if that sloop commander was a Partridge, did he ever get punished? Like, hey, you just let the monster of Elba escape?
Right. So there's a lot of questions you're thinking. I'll try to take them all. All right. I talk about some of them in the article, but not all of them, so I can. The number one problem is that they make Napoleon a sovereign. He is actually in charge of Elba as a prince, king, whatever. That's his kingdom. And all kingdoms have armies, and all island kingdoms have navies. And so they grant him they allow him to have somewhere between 700 and about 1,100 troops on the island with him. I think it's basically 550 of them are from his Imperial Guard, and then he sort of recruits another 500 Albans to it, so that the die-hard troops get to go with him. They're not just his followers; they're actually actual soldiers. And then he builds an army on Elba because he's the king of Elba, so he can do that. It's not illegal. He's not actually violating any structures in doing that. Similarly, if you are an island kingdom like that, you need something to communicate with the mainland, right? Elba can't survive all by itself out there. So they allow him to have a sloop. And the sloop is not a giant 3-masted vessel like in the movie, but it's still it's a sloop of war, right? It's got guns on it and it can sail places. And then he sort of cobbles together transports, about 6 or 7 of them from the island, from fishing vessels that are on the island, and sort of repurposes them as landing ships to put the men on the ships. And over the course of, I think, Kenny, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that he makes a decision really to go in about December of 1814. And so he spends about a month of January preparing this expedition. So they've got supplies, they've got all their stuff out in the docks, they repaint the vessel to make it look like it's a British sloop. They do all these things, and Addie keeps, the commander you're talking about, keeps visiting periodically to show up, say, hey, just checking in, how are things going? Can I do anything? And for whatever reason, he doesn't, alarm bells aren't ringing. Among the reasons they're not ringing is that the commissioner on Elba, Campbell, the colonel that I told you about, spent most of his time actually on the mainland visiting an occultist who was predicting his future and stuff like that, and he was also sleeping with her, and also she was probably Napoleon's spy, so she was in his pay, and that whole experience meant that Campbell wasn't ever around to do anything. But on the other hand, Campbell's orders weren't stay there and watch the guy so he doesn't leave. His orders were, well, if he's under, be his bodyguard, and there's no reason to be the bodyguard of a king of an island in the Mediterranean that's really boring to be on if you're not doing anything. And so all that led to Addie had a chance to see what he needed to see, to recognize that there was a problem and say something about it. And then he intercepted them at sea and should have seen something again, right? There were moments in which Addie could have rescued this whole thing by capturing Napoleon at sea, and he blew it. And when he gets back home, all the talk of the town is how this guy blew it, right? But his admiral in charge covers it up for him. So Penrose is the guy who follows Exmouth as the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean, and he was like, he's writing in his journal, he's like, I bet Addie screwed this up. And then he looks back and he's like, you know what? No, he was fine. Nothing he did was wrong. He didn't actually violate any of his orders, right? This is all thing. Because again, his orders weren't keep Napoleon on the island. His orders were in case there are any extraordinary circumstances. So what the hell does that mean, right? So it is a shambles. It's like top to bottom. You got a strategic failure, you got an operational failure, you got a tactical failure. Like you want to hunt for failure, but like I said, it's kind of like a plane crash, right? It's not just one thing that causes all this trouble. It's like a 1,000 different things went wrong.
But on top of that, there are also a good number of very high-ranking, socially high-ranking, politically high-ranking Britons, Whigs, namely
visiting.
Lord Holland, constantly visiting Napoleon and sort of worshipping at his court, and who are sort of actively egging this thing on. And
Can I tell a funny story?
yeah,
So among the British captains who are in the Mediterranean, Napoleon, they like to visit Elba because it's cool to see the most famous man in the world, and so they go to visit. And when they do that, one ship in particular decides to throw a ball on board the ship, and they invite Napoleon as their guest of honor, and they put him on a throne on the quarterdeck. Right? Well, that doesn't. You think, well, that doesn't really matter. But except that the British government maintained a policy throughout this entire process that Napoleon was an illegitimate emperor. They never called him emperor. They said the chief of the French government is what he was called. But here is a Royal Navy captain treating him like an emperor on board his ship. The other thing that's funny is that each of the captains of the Mediterranean squadron were issued portraits of Napoleon so that they could identify him should they come across one of the ships that were at sea. The downside of that is that it made it appear to the observers that all of the ships in the Royal Navy were led by captains who were secret Bonapartists because they all had portraits of Napoleon in their cabins. So shambles, top to bottom, just a mess. Yeah.
No, for more a comment than a question, but the whole bullet point is British are just exhausted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're ready for peace.
Yeah.
And they're just ready for the over with, and they're just tired.
To the internal factor.
I think it's
Yeah.
most importantly internally driven.
They're just off their game.
War exhaustion and
Yeah.
people have had
How
enough.
many 20?
It also makes me think about, in Josh's case, like Melville wrote a crappy order that really constrained Durham. Did he notice, Josh? Like, I mean, how important is the station in his thinking? How much thought do you think he put into the order? Or is it just like, well, that's another item on my to-do list today. Like, what's next?
Yeah, as you all know, that's a very hard question to answer because we weren't able to find any of that level of thought or correspondence. It appears with our hindsight that it was I've got Wellington's army to support. I'm going to dash this off to get this theater out of my mind. So I don't think he paid a lot of attention to it. I really don't. I think he dashed off something that he thought would take this area off his plate and just let it go.
Yeah, I was just going for Joshua was going to both comment and question. I know your focus was more on the British, but I think an interesting look is when you look at Linois versus Vaugirard, is Linois is the apolitical, careerist officer, right? Where he has served multiple regimes, and as you can see, as you said in your paper, right, he's trying very hard to toe this line of maintain order for the state. Vaugirard is a political hack. Right. I mean, he's a traitor to his nation. He turns over not only himself but the ship of the line in 1792 to the British. And what's fascinating to me, and I know it wasn't your focus, is you mentioned how Vaugirard is claiming for troops. Now, knowing Martinique is actually a very pro-Anglophile French island. In fact, it's so much so that in 1809, when it's captured, right, the troops don't turn out. It had been controlled by the British from 1794 to 1802. So I'm curious about that period from 1809 to 1815. Either what is the British occupation doing so poorly that's causing these Anglophile colonists to actually want to go back to Bonaparte because they hated the Bonapartist regime. And so it's curious to know. The 1794-1802 period has been really studied, but I don't think people have really looked at that British occupation of the Caribbean islands. 15.
That's a very good point, and I didn't find a lot of sources on Martinique. And I'm sure you've read General Blair's pamphlet General Boyer being the second in command to Linois on Guadeloupe, right? After he gets home, he's sentenced to death. It's all commuted. He waits till Linois passes away and publishes a 40-page pamphlet of, hey, why I was a great guy. And that's where a lot of the information on what happens on Guadeloupe comes through. But there's not a lot on Martinique, unfortunately. But from what happened on Guadeloupe, it was a fascinating story that definitely deserves a deeper look.
I can tell you what happened on Guadeloupe. Cochran was governor from 1810 to 1814.
Yeah.
So maybe it was,
With that jackass in charge,
maybe
like,
it was his fault.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, knowing what he did, especially in the 1809 and other stuff, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So I don't think he was particularly a very generous governor
No.
by any extent.
Yeah, if you believe General Boyer's pamphlet, right, the restoration of Guadeloupe to the New Bourbon governor was incredibly contentious, and all the British wanted to do was rob everybody blind, and it was wonderful.
But which is true.
Yeah, right. It's true.
So in addition to Elba, were there any other options on the table to place Napoleon? Was execution on the table, or was that just not politically viable? Was there an option to send him into, say, just a standard prison with at least walls to guards?
Yeah.
Or was that just not a viable option, that he needed to be given a place, I guess, to govern, to maybe prevent?
Yeah, so he's treated as a prince, and therefore he's treated as one of the sort of members of the club, and he'd married into the right places in order to sort of establish himself as a member of the European elite. So executing him was off the table. Kenny might be willing to weigh in here, but yeah. So I was just gonna say, I know that St. Helena is brought up in
It's
this
on the table
in this
early.
period, but it's not so John Barrow is the one who takes credit later for this idea that he's the second secretary of the Admiralty who takes credit for the idea of putting him in St. Helena. And I think that is, he sort of first mentions it in 1814 as a, hey, this might work, but he doesn't really campaign for it as the definitive thing until after Waterloo. I think the other thing that Napoleon tries to do after Waterloo is he tries to go to London. He tries to go to become in exile in Britain.
Yeah.
But I don't remember how much he's thinking about that in
Reading.
in April. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Set me
Yeah.
up in Reading.
Yeah.
And then part of this gets to like what you're talking about the Russians is the part of it is the Russians want to put Bernadotte on the throne. So
Right.
there's a lot of this negotiation where, I mean, kind of the reason why the British are okay with sending Napoleon to Elba, though it's not their first choice, but at the same time they get the Bourbons on the throne. So I mean, when you look at the Congress of Vienna, it's all of these compromises that are sometimes three-part agreements, right? So it's hard to break it apart without looking at, well, okay, but Britain's getting what they want by putting the Bourbons back on the throne, France with reduced borders in 1793, and all these things sort of fit together.
An island in the Mediterranean isn't a totally insane idea.
Right.
Elba probably is. Like, he's from Corsica, for God's sake. Like, look at the map, it's right there. This is, they literally sent him home. So maybe pick a different one.
Well, this is the funny thing about the Bonapartes. Well, the Bonaparte family is not well looked upon in Corsica, right? Because it's Pascal Paoli who's the true Corsican hero. The Bonapartists are collaborators, right? So they sided with the French government, and that's why Napoleon goes off to school. And in fact, his family's kicked out of the island. That's why Mom and everyone shows up. Is he can't be sent back to
They're all exiled. Yeah.
But this is like, oh, what's the thing close to Corsica? That's the closest thing to Corsica.
Right.
Let's go with that. Right. Yeah. So there are other places you could have put him in the Mediterranean where you could have kept a closer eye on him, and he wouldn't have been as close to France. I mean, one of the comments that comes after they figure out he's going to Elba is Sidney Smith, who's like, is the distance between, let me back up. The British government defends Elba to Parliament after the decision's been made. They have to own it, right? Because the Tsar made the decision, but the British didn't make enough of a fuss. So you got to own this decision. And they say, well, it'll be fine, right? Elba's really close to Italy. It's not really close to France, right? And okay, technically that's true, yes. And Sidney Smith, who's a British admiral, who looks at the map and he's like, is the distance between Elba and France anything to a guy who walked to Moscow and back, right? Like, this is not, you're not talking about like, you didn't send him to the Far East, right? You sent him, home effectively. Like, what are you doing? So, yeah, I think the British could have kept him on an island if they wanted to, but they didn't want to.
I think it's Peter Hall who's written about the fact that by December, real word is getting back to Napoleon that that they are getting ready to send him to St. Helena, and that this is actually the catalyst that says, okay, well, if I'm going to act
Yeah.
like that now. So
So you're saying.
it's been on the
they're
table for a while,
reconsidering about
and
it.
it's percolating, and it's becoming a real thing by the end of 1814.
Yeah.
Because they realize they have huge problems in keeping him there. They have to chop him off. So he's going to move. He
Yeah.
better do it quick.
And not to mention, Louis isn't confident doing all
Right.
sorts of
Right. He's,
cashiering the army, and so
Yeah.
he's turning all these opponents against him. Yeah.
yeah.
Do we have any questions online?
That's right, I'm seeing.
I thought I saw something pop up that somebody had a question, but I didn't.
Don't raise your hand, but
Yeah, Bob raised her hand.
Oh, Bob came in?
Yeah, she's off
Oh,
now.
she's off.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
That was great.
5 minutes? Or we can go to coffee early.
It's kind of great. We'll just sit around and have a conversation about stuff we're all interested in. It's kind of great.
It's really,
If you wanted to email, Josh Weiss, is that possible to get his email?
Yeah. Hey, Evan, would you just give them my email, please?
yeah, because I like to.
Okay, nothing else? Well, please join me in thanking our fine
Yes.
panel.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Aaron.
Hey,
Josh's email?
yes,
Josh's email.
hey,
Josh, I got you. Good to see you, man.
Shut